death asks a question. It asks, have you lived a meaningful life? Is death worth dying? Has your life justified your death? And when death asks you whether or not your life has justified your death, for the first time, you can ask yourself, even on an instinctual level, what would it mean to justify my life? What is the meaning of a life? How can we confront death, suffering, and limitations? Today we're going to talk about the ways in which reality limits our ability to be authentic. The degree to which reality prevents us in one way or another from acting for the sake of what we value. And we're going to be talking about those kinds of categories that prevent this in a universal way that every single person experiences. And this is principally death, suffering, and personal limitations. All three of these things are what each and every individual faces in their life, pretty much no matter who they are. Everyone dies, everyone suffers, and everyone has limits. There is this kind of inbuilt humility to the nature of existence that cuts short all of our attempts to act for the sake of what we value, that limits and breaks the ultimate extent of everything that we do. And if we want to prevent ourselves from just slipping into an endless kind of nihilism, then we want to be able to think about and ask ourselves, how can we deal with these different aspects of reality that interfere with our ability to be authentic? And if it's really the case that these are universal limits and are universally inescapable, then what is the best way of dealing with them? And so we'll start with talking about the broad strategy here, which is facing up to the truth of these things, facing up to the fact that we're all going to suffer and die, and that we all exist within certain personal limitations. Accepting this truth is crucial because it helps one to orient themselves realistically to the actual reality in which one lives. This is sort of the base case in dealing with reality itself. There's no room to purposely put oneself into illusion or delusion, to pretend that one is going to live forever, to pretend that one isn't really going to suffer, or to pretend that one's limitations aren't really limitations. There's no value in denying reality, because the more that we deny our reality, the truth of ourselves, the truth of the world, the truth of the existential in the broader sense, the less and less capacity we have to actually deal with the reality. The more we delude ourselves, the worse of a map we have to navigate the world. We are already fighting through personal illusions that come from our social circumstances, the parent-child relationship, the limitations of our ability to reason and to sense and to know the world, and the force-based institutions that are continually propagandizing our minds. We already have to fight through so much illusion in the world. There's not much use in adding more illusion on top of that. I'll emphasize here as well that I am taking this entire topic from a secular point of view. I mean, as you can tell, I have a cross here, I'm a Christian, and there's a different Christian answer, or a more complex and complete Christian answer to this question. But in this video series, I've been sticking to the philosophical account of, or the secular account of my philosophy. Later on, we'll talk about how all this integrates into the broader understanding of Christianity. But this video is specifically related to the secular point of view. So we are taking death as an ultimate reality, suffering as an ultimate reality, limitations as an ultimate reality. And again, in line with everything else that we do in our life, we ought to confront it forthrightly, and we ought to use our reason about the truth to the greatest extent of our ability to deal with it. If we get the truth of these things, then we can devise accurate strategies to dealing with them. If you have a disease, but you're unwilling to accept the diagnostic, then you can't effectively treat it. You can't effectively cure it, if that's possible. So you always need the truth. You always need the true diagnostic of the problem. With that being said, we can start with the first of these, which is death. The inevitability of death is perhaps one of the more ironic things in human life because so much of human life is striving against death. It is acting for the sake of life so that we can have the time and the opportunity to pursue what we genuinely value. And the specter of death that constantly haunts our experience of the world, ironically enough, takes away most of the time of actually living. Much of life is, again, simply devoted to avoiding death. And so death doesn't simply have this limitation on us in terms of the ultimate termination of the ability to be authentic, the ultimate termination of the ability to act for the sake of your own values, but it haunts us in a day-to-day capacity. It haunts us in the fact that so much of our existence revolves around what we need to do in order to stave off death, not prevent death, but stave it off. Much of what I'm going to talk about in relation to death follows Heidegger's analysis of how death interacts with the individual. So I don't want to claim that anything of this is original, and most of my philosophy is not original to any extent, but this section in particular, I follow Heidegger quite clearly, even though I'll probably use more simplistic terminology here. Now, of course, death, like the other things on this list, is not able to be ultimately overcome. Each and every one of us is going to die. People will try to overcome death, but ultimately we are all condemned to die. And so we have to ask the question, how do we confront death? Not so much how we overcome death. So the question really becomes, how can we best use the fact of death to our own best advantage in the pursuit of authenticity and meaning and happiness and joy? And what attitude in general should we have towards the death? And the first of these is going to be using death as a mirror for the authentic self. Again, this is something that Heidegger talked about, but it's essentially the idea that when we contemplate our own death, it oftentimes brings a certain kind of clarity to how we're going about living our lives and what we're prioritizing in our lives. When we imagine ourselves on our deathbed and ask ourselves, what kind of life would we have wanted to lead at that point? What kind of reputation would we want to have? What kind of person would we want to be on our deathbed? Posing the question like that, bringing our death to the forefront, gives us a certain kind of clarity about what it is that we actually want. Psychologically, I think this is the case because it removes the impetus of survival. When survival is no longer on the table, then our mind gives free rein to pure expression, to the idea of what it sort of instinctually wants. Even if it doesn't have a great concrete idea of that, it can give us a more solid picture of what we truly want rather than the things that we are forcing ourselves to pursue in order to continue the day-to-day life. Sometimes what we think we want in the moment of life is more money or another car or a more comfortable space or a new girlfriend or a different job, a different career, kids, social acceptance, praise, fame. In many ways, because these are so intimately related to our success in our ability to live and our success in order to achieve a sort of personal freedom to pursue what we actually want. But when the pressures of life go away because death is staring us in the face, all of that is removed to give us the true picture of what we want. Now, of course, you still have the problem of once you get that clear picture, you have to kind of go back to your life and you still have the problem of survival. But now you know where your real priorities lie because they're not buried in layers of illusion of what you think you need, but you can start to really rationally examine your life and ask yourself, okay, what do I really need in order to survive? And what do I really need in order to pursue what I value? Because you've broken through the pressures and the psychological tensions of survival to get that clear image of what you actually want. When faced with death, we are moved beyond the psychological tensions that are created in the parent-child dynamic. We are moved beyond the false self. We are moved beyond the needs of survival. And we are moved beyond everything about oneself that has no meaning. Because death asks a question. It asks, have you lived a meaningful life? Is death worth dying? Has your life justified your death? And when death asks you whether or not your life has justified your death, for the first time, you can ask yourself, even on an instinctual level, what would it mean to justify my life? What is the meaning of a life? And that naturally gets answered by what your what your authentic instinct is. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go out and seek experiences in which your life is in danger in order to get a true picture of yourself. But what it does mean is that the contemplation of death and the inevitability of death and the unknowable time of death, contemplating these kinds of things can get you closer to a true sense of yourself and can even help you on an instinctual level reprioritize and reorganize what it is that you're actually going after in your life. On top of that, death has a unique ability, I think, to motivate somebody to actually act on that authentic instinct or act on that authentic picture. Again, meditating on the inevitability of death and the unknowability of when that death might occur can help you to cut out those parts of your life, cut out that time in your day that is otherwise wasted, that is otherwise blown on a bunch of things that don't actually give you that much meaning and perhaps serve really only as distractions. When we're in the midst of life, I think especially the younger we are, the more prone we are to having this illusion that life is going to continue on inevitably and that death is something far into the future that we have plenty of time to deal with. But when we contemplate directly on our death, we recognize that that picture of death far into the future is something completely uncertain, as well as an illusion. And so the contemplation of death, in fact, again, the realistic acceptance and contemplation of one's death gives you a realistic timeline and a realistic picture of the degree or the chances of death in one's life. And that better picture of reality helps you to more accurately orient your behavior towards who you really are. So not only does death allow you to see who you really are more accurately, but actually motivates you to act for the sake of who you truly are. Or if it provides an unclear picture, it motivates you to understand who you really are and seek self-knowledge. And so confronting death directly, confronting the truth of death directly, and making the regular contemplation of one's death a part of life in the right way can create a far more authentic life and a far more meaningful life. Now, the contemplation of death is not supposed to be morbid in the sense of fear. The last thing that I think, the last attitude to have towards death is actually what I call deathlessness. And deathlessness is this attitude of distancing death from the act of choice and distancing the reality of death from the risks that are assumed in choices. The contemplation of death is not something which ought to result in fear and therefore rigidity of action and a retreat in order to protect oneself. Because of course the reality of death is that you cannot protect yourself from it. It's coming for you whether or not you want it to. So the deathless attitude is to accept the reality of death, but not allow it to therefore drive your actions. You see, when you are constantly chasing after the avoidance of death, then your life becomes about survival rather than individual meaning or happiness. But when you have a deathless attitude, the attitude is closer to, I'm going to die, so I can't prevent this. So what actions can I take that are really free, or at least closer to who I am? Where in my life am I sacrificing time and resources, just energy and thought, into maintaining my survival that are above and beyond what is actually necessary, that actually don't have anything to do with my authentic values? You have to make choices and spend time and resources and energy in order to survive, but there are oftentimes a massive overextension that occurs in maintaining that survival. You, as an accountant, for an example, for 30 plus years, because it provides you this steady paycheck and it gives you this retirement portfolio and income, and it allows you to buy a car and a house, and because it's a respectful job, and because this was something your parents encouraged you to get into, and because nobody has any problems with somebody being an accountant, even though it doesn't reflect What is that you actually value, even though it doesn't really make you happy, even though the amount of money you make as an accountant is far more than would be necessary to pursue what you actually value, maybe reading or writing or something like that. Your life gets caught up and consumed by the time and the energy and resources that are necessary to do this accounting job instead of being oriented to who you actually are and what you actually want to value. And if you were to confront death and the reality of death, then it would allow you to say, am I prioritizing this time in the right way? And are my choices about preventing death that I can't prevent, or about the authentic prioritization of time and resources for the sake of what I truly value? And I think the more we contemplate death, the more we get this deathless attitude, the more we stop worrying about whether or not we're going to be able to survive, whether or not we're going to be socially accepted, which has the undercurrent of the death threat, whether or not we're pleasing our parents, which has this undercurrent of the death threat, whether or not we're devoting ourselves to survival rather than to authenticity. And the contemplation of death allows us to become more and more deathless, meaning that more and more of our choices are oriented not towards survival, but towards authenticity. And so we become much more efficient in our actions towards our authenticity. The next universal limit on our authenticity, the thing that we inevitably have to deal with and confront, is suffering. Every single human being will suffer to some extent in their lives, and the extent of that suffering is often measured subjectively, meaning that two people can suffer the very same thing, and the degree of suffering can be extremely different. Or someone can suffer something that is most other people would consider to be traumatic and not get much suffering from it, whereas another person could suffer something which seems minor to everybody else, but they can be relatively traumatized from it. There are, of course, certain kinds of suffering that are more universal than others, but the point to say that the actual point of suffering is typically subjective, because suffering ultimately comes down to experiencing a non-value. And the degree of suffering is the degree to which what you're experiencing is a non-value. So things like starvation, for example, are an extreme non-value. Bodily pain is an extreme non-value. And losing a relationship oftentimes is an extreme non-value. But yet there are instances of all three of these in which people pursue them as values. So people who are fasting, for example, or you might say monks who are choosing some sort of asceticism when it comes to not eating. Some people deliberately go out and experience pain as a form of pleasure, extreme sporting events or certain fetishes and things like that. And many people end relationships because ultimately being in the relationships is of a greater non-value than being out of them. So suffering is something that is incredibly subjective on the one hand, but incredibly universal on the other hand, in the sense that everybody experiences it. Everybody at some point endures non-values. And so how do we confront this? Because of course it's a great drag, and the more we get wrapped up in suffering, the more it can limit our authenticity. And of course we don't want to suffer. Suffering is one of those things which, though it can't be avoided, it can be reduced. So how do we confront suffering? Well, the first thing is to call suffering suffering. I think there are plenty of philosophical traditions who try to turn suffering into something that is ultimately good. I think it was Nietzsche did a lot of this, as far as I can tell. And I think at one point he went even so far as to wish suffering upon his friends and family, because he believed that through the suffering, it would actually create in them a greater strength in the overcoming, and ultimately a greater ability to, become, to sort of determine their own values for themselves, right? And I disagree with this because I think it undercuts the whole meaning of suffering. If suffering is only something that is just momentarily negative, but then later becomes good or makes up for it or becomes way better than the momentary suffering, then it's not really suffering, because people would actively act for the sake of it. I mean, exercise is probably the most common example of this, where practically nobody who's sane likes to exercise, but people do it all the time in order to maintain their health and build their strength and make themselves look more aesthetically beautiful for all kinds of reasons. They endure the temporary discomfort of exercise in order to reap the benefits of that exercise in the future. And so it's suffering in the sense that temporarily there is goodness involved, but ultimately, or say temporarily there is suffering involved, but ultimately there is no suffering. And the way that I'm using, or you could say there's temporarily pain, but then there's ultimately gain, right? But the way that I'm using suffering is true suffering, something that is a real non-value, not just a temporary non-value, not just a temporary pain, but something which is completely unchosen and which is directly a non-value. Most of the major moral crimes are in this category in terms of their effect on people when it comes to suffering. So I think the first thing is to call suffering what it is, which is suffering, unredeemable, always bad, something that cannot be made up for. And I think it's important because, again, we're going back to the reality principle. We need to get the truth of these things if we're going to be able to deal with them correctly. And the reality of suffering is that if it is suffering, it is a complete non-value. It is an ultimately unchosen thing. And I think taking suffering as suffering and the fact that it can't be redeemed or made up for highlights the seriousness of suffering. Sometimes when we experience when somebody around us experiences suffering, or suffering is being inflicted on somebody, there is this instinct to try to cover it over by saying, well, at least it wasn't this, or at least you're not suffering like this person, or ultimately this is going to make you stronger because of this. There is this attempt to change the fact of suffering into something that's actually good in the end, or comparatively better than some other kind of suffering. And it's not that there's not degrees of suffering, or that you can't make some good out of suffering, but it's to say that suffering is actually a bad thing. And that's not obvious to most people unless they're in it, right? But if we take suffering as actually a bad thing and actually suffering, then we take it more seriously, and we take the desire to reduce that kind of suffering in the world more seriously. We take the suffering of the people around us more seriously and can empathize with it more directly when we say, no, this is a bad thing, flat out. No external justifications, no trying to make it into something better, nothing like that, but simply this is suffering, accepting it as a fact, as a truth that one deals with, that is a part of life, and that is, in one sense, okay to experience, not in the sense that you want to experience suffering, but in the sense that you are allowed to suffer. You are allowed to suffer in the world, and to simply label it as suffering and nothing else. I know this is getting a little bit roundabout and tautological, but there is something important there. I think by taking it seriously, then we're, again, much more motivated to prevent it in our own lives and in the world, because we recognize it for what it actually is. All that being said, it doesn't mean that we can't make something out of it. And it doesn't mean that our individual and personal attitude towards it can't be one of seeing what can we make the best out of this. But it's important that that's a secondary stage and not a beginning stage. And I use my own experience in terms of child abuse. And I experienced child abuse growing up. And the way that I orient, this is sort of a major source of suffering for me in my life. And the way I've oriented myself to it is to say, what I experienced was bad. What I experienced was suffering. Suffered when I was being abused as a child. Not, I was abused as a child, but it made me a stronger person, which may be true, but is a way of trying to distance yourself from the truth of the suffering and what it was. Whereas if I allow myself to experience that and say, yes, I did suffer and it was horrible and these are all my feelings, and I'm allowed to experience the fact that I'm suffering, then I can orient myself towards it realistically, rather than trying to cover it over with excuses or perceived benefits that could come about from it. But once you've kind of accepted that as the truth, you've allowed yourself to experience it consciously and emotionally, you can then step back and see, okay, well, because I've taken my own suffering seriously here, what can I get out of this so it's not a complete non-value? And how can I use this to prevent suffering in the future? And again, in my own case, it's something like philosophy, or talking about the parent-child relationship, because of what I've experienced in my childhood abuse, and the fact that I took that abuse seriously, the suffering in that abuse seriously, that has motivated me not only to sort of figure out the things that have helped me to navigate that, but also to try to develop a philosophical perspective that incorporates that and can hopefully be helpful to other people in the future, and to advocate things like peaceful parenting, for example, that other people might eventually pick up and be able to use in their lives, and so that children in the future won't experience the same kind of suffering that I suffered. It motivated me to understand fields like psychology and philosophy and ethics, which have helped me to navigate my life as an adult. And again, I hope that some of the value of that can come across here. But that's just sort of one example. But the fact that I was able to turn that suffering, I was able to get some goodness out of that suffering, does not change the fact of the suffering itself. And I think it's really important to keep those two in mind, because if you try to make up for the suffering, so to speak, which you can't ever do because it's happened, it's in the past, and you can't ever change the suffering that happens in the past. You can never make up for evil in the world. You can never make up for immorality in the world, really, because it's already happened. The only way you can truly make up for suffering in the world would be to go back in time and prevent it from ever happening, but that's impossible. And so the suffering is a fact of existence. The suffering is a fact of your story, and accepting that fact, I think, again, highlights the seriousness of it. But simply sitting in the seriousness of it doesn't actually help to mitigate the pain or to produce goodness in the future. And so you have to have these both in balance, where you say this suffering was real and serious because it is suffering. It's not something that gets to be turned into gold and therefore justified as suffering. And at the same time, you want to, once you've gone beyond the suffering, you've accepted it, you've been able to experience it emotionally, asking yourself, okay, what can I use from that can be valuable to me now? And this, to a degree, can happen within the suffering. I mean, there are famous examples in things like war, for example. I'm thinking of someone like Janis Korczak, who was a Jewish pedagogue who ran a children's orphanage I think he ran it even before World War I, but he ran it through to World War II. And during that time, even though, of course, he was suffering and the children were suffering, he was able to run this orphanage and use the circumstances to write these really just amazing journals about what was going on. And of course, his more pedagogical works in how to relate to children that have extreme value, I think, today, especially in the peaceful parenting circles. And, there's an example of somebody who, in the midst of suffering, found a way to extract some value out of it, even though, of course, what he went through was suffering. And ultimately, he died joining the children in his orphanage on the trains to these extermination camps. And there's an example of heroically extracting some good out of the suffering in the world, even though that goodness does not then justify the suffering. And that's really the most important point here. Suffering is suffering. We can get goodness out of it, but the goodness never justifies the suffering. And we have to take suffering seriously for what it is, so that we are motivated to prevent it in the future for ourselves and for other people. And the last point I would make when it comes to confronting suffering is to recognize that the degree to which we take suffering seriously and accept suffering as suffering, and we don't try to justify it. I think in the same way we get this parallel attitude towards joy in our lives when we do get to manifest what we value, when we get to be authentic, when we get to act for the sake of what we truly value, and out of that we get happiness and joy and satisfaction. We don't have to then go and justify it by, how much suffering we've gone through in order to get it. We can just enjoy it for what it is. And we can take the joy seriously. We can take the happiness seriously. We can take the authentic self seriously as well. If we try to justify the suffering by the goodness that we can get out of it, then we are often in the position of justifying the goodness that we've gotten out of things by the way that we've suffered. Which reminds me of those kind of relationships that some people have, where they tie in love with how much their partner is willing to suffer for them, or tie in their own love with how much they're willing to suffer for their partner. You kind of get these warped perspectives on emotions, and this tying in of joy and suffering that does not have a necessary relationship to one another. You can get good out of suffering, and I think that's a good attitude to have towards suffering, but there's no need to justify it by getting good out of it. And the last one we're going to talk about is just sort of limitations. This is the fact that our dreams for what we want out of the world really outstrip our reality for human beings. We almost never, I would say actually never, get what we want out of the world. Our lives always, in one way or another, run up short against our expectations and what we desire. And this is just what a part of what it means to be human beings. We have been gifted with the ability to dream of a better world, to think of a better world, which allows us to act for the sake of a better world. And similarly for ourselves, we can think of ourselves in an idealistic way. And this gives us the ability to act for the sake of that better thing and really get a little bit better and really make the world a little bit better, but never our ultimate expectations, our ultimate ideal picture of ourselves, which can cause this kind of frustration in life. And depending on how you're actually limited in the world, this can run into sort of extreme frustrations, I think, for a lot of people. Again, depending on who you are. A lot of these things end up being subjective because it depends on what you truly value. But I think we all run up against our limitations. And so how can we confront this? How can we confront the fact that we're limited, that our dreams outrun our reality? Well, the first way is to really get an accurate self-evaluation, right? Really get an accurate evaluation of the world around you. This is a reason why reason is so important. This is a reason why philosophy is so important, because it gives you the tool to be able to accurately judge the truth of yourself and the world around you so that you can navigate it better. We may think that we're not capable of achieving X thing. We'll say, I'll never be a good writer because you've never really put in any of the work to write, or maybe you've only written for a year, and so you haven't had the time to develop the quality. And then you come to this short-sighted conclusion that, well, I'll never be a good writer, even if that's something you genuinely want to do. I mean, I'm kind of having that when it comes to the video recording, where I am pursuing this with no idea whether or not I'll ever actually be good enough for something like this to become the kind of thing that I dream about it being. But I don't know my potential for doing it because I haven't done it enough. I think this is my only 14th or 15th video, and every time I record something, I get a little bit better. I'm learning how to edit and do it in intros and thumbnails and different things like that, and trying out different strategies for producing the content while keeping it authentic. But it's too early to tell whether I'm good at this or not, right? But that's an example where I don't know whether or not ability to do something I value is up to what I'm dreaming about. So I need to use my reason to ask myself, okay, let's test this. Let's test this by let's say I'll do 100 videos and see whether it improves or not, and give myself the time to test. And not only that, but take the risks to do so. So oftentimes we don't even try to achieve our dreams because we're afraid that we might fail, and we're afraid that we might not live up to it. But of course, if we put the fear aside for a second, if we put the death fear aside for a second and pursue it anyway, do that radical, authentic action, then we'll often find that we get closer to our dreams than otherwise. And so continually having this rational self-examination, developing greater and greater self-knowledge by taking greater and greater introspective time to introspect and time to evaluate one's circumstances, that is, really think about oneself and think about one's life, and combine that with the sort of radical, risky testing of what you can do given what you want to do, then you get the most accurate picture that you can. It's not going to be 100% accurate, and you're going to experience failures and fear and limitations. Again, you're still going to run up against the same wall, but this gives you an accurate picture of where the wall is. Oftentimes, again, we don't have that. We have a distorted sense of what we can actually do in our lives because of many of the psychological tensions that I've talked about in previous videos. Using our reason helps us to overcome that barrier in the moment. The more that we pursue our authentic self-knowledge, the better our reason will be able to take an accurate account of our real capabilities. So what you once thought was a dream can quickly turn into a reality if you're willing to take the risk, and if you're willing to actually test it, and if you're willing to deliberately use your reason. Secondly, would be what I call like alternative avenues for the same kind of meaning, like trying to figure out alternative ways. For instance, I met this person once who they really wanted to be a cop, and they had a problem with their foot so that they weren't able to become a cop. And you might be tempted to think, well, okay, this person wanted to be a cop, and now they can't do it because of, some sort of issue with their foot. So therefore they just have to sort of accept their limitations and move on to something else. But in the course of our conversation, one of the things that I asked him was, well, what did it mean for you to be a cop? And he said something like, well, I really wanted to protect people. I wanted to protect people and really be a hero to especially younger people, motivate them to be heroic. And that dream is a much broader dream than being a cop. I mean, there are a variety of ways in which you could go about doing that. There are a variety of ways in which you could mentor young people to be heroic. And I asked him to contemplate some of that. I asked him to think about, well, are there other ways that you could live this out in your life? And that's kind of the advice that I'm giving here, is that oftentimes we think that our authentic self and what we truly value is attached to concrete ideas or concrete roles rather than to the values which make up those roles. We may think, I want to be a video game designer, and then we have a really hard time with coding. But it actually turns out that what you really wanted was a form of artistic expression. And so you start drawing, and it turns out that you're actually really good at drawing. And now that meaning, that authentic part of yourself is fulfilled through something like drawing rather than video game design. You can often find that there are a wide varieties of alternatives for pursuing the same kinds of values that you feel limited by. And so that can be a good alternative if there are those limitations. And thirdly would be what I call, and I don't know if this is a great term for it, but I call it like secondhand authenticity. And this is when you recognize that, okay, you really can't pursue what you want to value, right? You really can't pursue whatever it is that you want to do, or you're not having a lot of success at it, right? But you still have a lot of knowledge and experience and interest in it to be able to guide somebody else to be able to do it. I think the most concrete example I can think of here are like coaches. There are lots of coaches for different sports where the coaches themselves never got to play baseball or basketball or be a martial art expert, or they were never wildly successful in the actual sport themselves. But they have all this kind of knowledge and experience and interest in it that they get to use to help train people who go on to become those roles. And they sort of get the secondhand authenticity of it, and often find that they are able to manifest the value in some degree by manifesting it not for themselves, but through another person. But this isn't limited to just coaching or physical sports or things like that. This can be a variety of things. This can be music. Plenty of people who have lots of musical knowledge, maybe they know a lot about music theory, help people who know how to play instruments actually play better. Or editors who are really good at structuring the layout of writing, but are not really great in the creativity department, get to help writers to write their books. So there are a variety of mechanisms. Again, this takes some creative thinking. It takes, again, this deliberate, rational understanding of what you're really going after, and accurate self-knowledge. But you can often get the same kind of meaning for the value by helping another person achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. So in terms of the kind of natural limitations that we come up against, I think those three strategies are sort of the best you got. Again, none of these things are things that you ultimately can overcome. Death and suffering and your own personal limitations, you can't overcome them. They're universal experiences that you have to learn how to deal with. But what I've outlined in this video is just the strategies that I've come across and that have been helpful to me in sort of mitigating this and using these things to the best of my ability for the sake of my own authenticity. Ultimately, though, the underlying theme here is that you have to confront each and every one of these things with the truth. You have to accept death as reality and keep it a reality in your mind. You have to accept suffering as suffering and keep it a reality in order to take it seriously. And you have to accept the reality of whatever limitations that you exist in and use that as your foundation for working around those. If you don't have a rational understanding of these things, if you don't have them at the forefront of how you're understanding yourself and the world, you can easily get off the rails here. You can be constantly frustrated in your inability to achieve your dreams because you're not realistic about your limitations. You can constantly be suppressing your feelings around the things that you've suffered, because you try to make up for all your suffering instead of just accepting it for what it is. And you can fall into the delusion that you're going to live forever and waste your life and waste your time on things that don't actually matter to you because you don't have a realistic understanding of your own mortality. So I think the theme that runs throughout here is just you have to confront these things with the truth. You have to confront these things with reason, and you have to confront these things in relationship to your true self, who you are, not who you've had to become. So with all that said, I think we're going to end the video here. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, I have done things a little bit differently today. I actually wrote out an outline. So I hope that the ideas came across a little bit more clear today, that perhaps there was more of a structured flow. I am trying to balance the authenticity on the one hand, the sort of speaking off the top of my head, with an attempt for clarity and structure, and trying to combine the best of both elements here. So I hope today was a little bit better than perhaps the rambling of other videos. I'm going to continue to try to make these better each and every time. I think every single video teaches me a lot about both producing the content and just how to sort of wrap that content in a way that can be appealing to you guys while still retaining the authenticity of the whole project. So again, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please like it, please share it if you think this would be helpful with somebody else, and subscribe for more. Thank you.